The statement that bumblebee flight is aerodynamically and scientifically impossible dates back to the 1930s. It was then that the statement was supposedly first made by an aerodynamics research group in Göttingen, Germany. Despite what researchers say, something must obviously be wrong, seeing as bumblebees can indeed fly. Even though this amazing feat is technically impossible, how do they pull it off? Even though man has witnessed this phenomenon for millenniums, it is only recently that we can really understand what is going on. At normal speed, their wings just blur together into one blob of motion. However, even slowed down, the answer doesn't appear much clearer as to how bees fly. We see that bees flap their wings at a rate of approximately 200 beats per second, that is, 12,000 times a minute. But surprisingly, this isn't technically enough to keep them airborne, with them being rather large and their wings rather small. We only see the real answer when we slow it down exponentially. We see here that at the end of each beat, the bee rotates its wing. By reversing the wing like this, you create thrust on both the downstroke as well as the upstroke. In other words, the bee is creating a constant upward thrust, thus making flight possible. It may not be perfect or elegant as the hummingbird's flight, however, the bee can indeed fly, and if needed, it can use its legs to balance. But how do honeybees make honey? Where does it come from? Well, it all starts with nectar. Nectar is made up of water along with a complex sugar called sucrose, but many people know this sugar as just regular table sugar. Bees dedicated to gathering nectar, known as foragers, suck up the nectar and store it in their second stomach, dedicated to nectar. This stomach is called the crop. The crop here is outlined in blue, and the bee's actual stomach is in red. After collecting enough nectar, the forager bee takes the honey back to the hive, where the nectar is regurgitated into the crop of another type of bee called the processor. The processor regurgitates the nectar into a cell where it will ripen. While regurgitating, the bee adds an enzyme known as invertase, also called sucrase. This enzyme separates the complex sugar in the nectar into two simple sugars, glucose and fructose. By now, the bees have essentially made honey, with just one problem. Honey has a water content of about 19%. Nectar has a water content of 70%, and even with the sugar separated, what the bee has placed in the cell is still 70% water. To solve the problem, the processing bee flaps its wings over the nectar, thus evaporating water out of it until it has ripened and reached its 18% goal. At this point, the honey is finished, and it contains so little water that microbes cannot grow in it, thus making it an impenetrable force to bacteria or fungi. Since the honey is finished, the cell is capped off with an airtight wax seal. If the cap is not airtight, then the honey will absorb moisture from the air and thus become susceptible to bacterial or fungal growth. This is the reason why it's important to screw the lid back onto your jar of honey, and why honey can be stored for years without refrigeration and still not go bad. But why do some honeys taste different? Well, purely because of location and plant species. Although nectar is made of sucrose and water, there are also trace amounts of other chemicals in there too. Different plants and environments mean slightly different nectar, which in turn means different taste. But why do some honeys advise not to give it to infants? Well, remember how bacteria and fungi can't grow in honey? Well, honey may still contain botulinum spores. These spores can't grow in honey, but they can still be there. And when consumed, the spores in the honey may become viable, and an infant's young immune system wouldn't be capable of protecting itself. Beeswax is commonly used in most lip balms and hand soaps, and it's made when honey is digested in the bee's wax gland. This wax is used to make the cells and combs in which honey is made. However, this poses a new type of chicken and egg scenario. If honey is needed to make wax, and wax to make honey, which came first? Thanks for watching.